So the easiest way to do this is probably
You can just use the up, down, or right, left. We'll move the same thing. Let me get the lights.
I just need to hit that.
Yeah.
North Street, public intermission.
Just a few lists. Okay. Okay. All right.
If for something like you on the keyboard, you get out of the actual presentation, F5 will put you back to your slideshow.
Okay. All right. You should be all set.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural lecture in our Social Justice and the Economy lecture series. I'm Nancy Tawana, and I'm the director of the Rock Ethics Institute. And this lecture series has been designed in order to provide an opportunity over the course of this year for us as a community here at Penn State and beyond, since we're media citing this, to think about the impact of our globalized economy and to think about the ways in which it's impacted various inequities in income, in wealth, and in power, both within nations as well as between nations. We're looking at a variety of different perspectives over the course of the year, including questions on economic justice by bringing an ethical lens to questions about economic policy, to think about the nature of corporate or public responsibility for the economically disadvantaged, the morality of economic practices that result in extreme inequities and human suffering, as well as the possibility of an ethically informed policy in areas of labor, economic development, tax, trade, and social institutions. I also have the great good fortune of reading our list of sponsors. There are a lot of people to thank for making this lecture series possible, including support from Richard and Ronnie Lippin, the Africana Research Center, the Department of African and African American Studies, the Department of Labor Studies and Industrial Relations, the Department of Psychology, the Department of Sociology, the Department of Women's Studies, and the University Library. All events sponsored by the Rock Ethics Institute are also made possible in part with the support of a generous gift from Doug and Julie Rock. I'll be asking Sandra Morgan, who's a new professor in women's studies and who is responsible for making this exciting lecture series happen, to introduce our speaker today. But before I do, let me remind you all of our next lecture, which is October 9th, here at Foster Auditorium, when Cassandra Venny will be discussing the racial and gender dynamics of being foreign in America. So let me welcome Sandra Morgan, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Before I do that, I just want to make a couple of comments and really add my thanks to both Nancy Tawana, the director of the Rock Ethics Institute, and Kathy Rumba and Barb Edwards, the staff, for their hard work in helping bring this series together. It's not so easy to pull together a lecture series when it's being planned coast to coast, since I was at the University of Oregon for the planning of this. And I am very happy to see you all here today, and I hope you will come back to the other speakers and tell your friends and colleagues to join you. Our goal over the coming year is to really subject the concept of economic justice to sustained interrogation. There's a lot of critique of globalization. There's not enough, I think, trying to envision what just, ethically just, morally just, socially just, economically just policies and programs and practices would look like. And we're going to be very fortunate to have very high caliber speakers, including our speaker today from Penn State and beyond, really help us get to a point, I think, by the end of the year where we'll have, I think, a much illuminated idea about economic justice. There really could be no better speaker to inaugurate the series here at Penn State than a scholar who has been working on issues of economic justice, particularly through the lens of labor, for a very long time, throughout, in fact, his whole career. Dr. Paul Clark, professor and head of the Department of Labor Studies and Industrial Relations here at Penn State. If Paul's interdisciplinary department is not enough, in addition to that, he also holds an appointment as professor in the Department of Health Policy and Administration. Paul's topic today is not the sum of what he has been doing in the area of labor relations and labor studies, but it's certainly directly related to a lot of the rest of the work he's done. His training, both in industrial and labor relations at the premier department at Cornell and then in public administration at the University of Pittsburgh, positioned him to examine labor issues both in an interdisciplinary way and in connection, very importantly, with worker and other organizations actively tackling what so many academics sit back and in a distanced way study. His research interests include employment relations in the United States healthcare industry, the globalization of the market for healthcare professionals, union structure, governance, administration, and union member commitment and participation. And in an era of extreme challenges in the labor movement, it is really only in the examination of labor issues globally that the labor movement in this country or beyond is going to have any chance of surviving the extreme difficulties of a globalizing economy. And we have research such as Paul's to thank for that. In addition to authoring 4 books, including most recently Building More Effective Unions, published by Cornell, and an edited book on collective bargaining in the private sector with John Delaney and Ann Frost, he's published widely. I'm not going to give you the whole list of his many articles, but in labor relations and labor studies. He's taught labor ed programs for local officers and activists from a wide variety of unions for over 25 years, and as I mentioned, has collaborated actively with such unions as the UMW, the United Mine Workers, the Steel Workers, the National Association of Letter Carriers, and the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO. When I was getting ready to come here, colleagues from all over the country said to me, as soon as you get there, you've got to meet Paul Clark. And I'm very glad that not only did I get to meet him, but I was privileged to ask him to help us begin what I hope you will join us for a long process of investigating this study. So, Paul, thank you, and we look forward to your remarks today.
Roy, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. You know, one of the nicest things you can do to a professor is give him an hour and a half in a nice room and ask him to talk about his research. And so I appreciate the opportunity to do so. One of the first things I have to, I think, be useful to tell you is how I got to this point and this topic. As the introduction suggests, I had been working for many years looking at labor relations in the American coal and steel industries. And gradually over time, those industries have been slipping away to the point where they're not nearly as significant as they used to be. So I began looking around for another industry to study. And it just so happens that I come from a medical family. I have a brother who's a physician and a sister who's a nurse and a second brother who's a hospital administrator. And I'm married to a nurse. And the healthcare industry seemed to be a natural place to look. And a more dysfunctional industry, unfortunately, I'm not sure I could have found. Our healthcare system in this country is in real crisis, as are most healthcare systems around the world. And so there's been plenty to look at on this topic. And since I began looking at the U.S. healthcare system, that research has broadened to look at healthcare systems around the world. And I should also say that I've been working on this research with Darlene Clark, who is a senior lecturer in the School of Nursing, and we've been collaborating on this research for several years now. Given my background, it was only natural that I would focus on the employment relations aspect of the healthcare industry. And I think that this particular issue, the migration of healthcare professionals, really does fit in a lecture series that's looking at social and economic justice. There's a lot of evidence that in at least some instances, globalization has had the effect of making poor countries poorer. And what the globalization of the labor market for healthcare professionals is doing, at least in some instances, is making poor countries sicker. And that's one of the points that I'll get back to later in the lecture. The migration of healthcare professionals is really not a new phenomenon in the world. Healthcare professionals, particularly from developing countries, have to some degree been migrating to developed countries, better healthcare systems for some time now. But what is unusual in terms of what we're seeing is that this process has accelerated significantly in recent years. We see much more migration of nurses, physicians, even pharmacists and other healthcare professionals. And this increase has been spurred on largely by a worldwide shortage of healthcare professionals. Today I'm going to focus largely on RNs, although we can come back and talk about physicians if that's of interest to folks. But I think this issue is most significant in terms of nurses and the degree to which nurses have been migrating. And, you know, if you've ever spent any time in a hospital, you know that the central healthcare provider, the most important person to you as you lay in that hospital bed, is going to be the nurses, because you'll see the physicians for a very short period of time every day if you're lucky. But it's going to be the nurses that are going to be there 7 days a week, 24 hours. When you're sick, when you're in distress, when you're having pain, it'll be the nurses that'll be there at 3 o'clock in the morning by your bedside to give you aid and assistance and comfort. And so nurses really are at the heart, I believe, of our healthcare system. And the phenomenon of migration really has been greatest in terms of that particular profession. Now, this is a complex issue, the migration of healthcare professionals, and it raises some complex ethical questions. Like a lot of ethical questions, there is no really black and white here. There are a lot of shades in between. But hopefully in the course of the presentation, I'll lay out some of the aspects of the ethical questions that arise when developed countries recruit healthcare professionals from developing countries, when wealthier countries recruit healthcare professionals from poorer countries. So as I mentioned, I want to focus largely on RNs here, and I want to talk a little bit about the reasons behind this phenomenon of immigration and recruitment. Talk a little bit about the scope of the phenomenon, the stakeholders who are involved, and the cost and benefits of migration and recruitment for those different stakeholders. And I want to touch on the ethical issues, certainly, and the strategies that have been proposed to deal with the problems that arise because of this increase in migration. So let's start with the United States. At the heart of this issue is a shortage of RNs. The United States has a significant shortage of RNs at this time. There have been periods of time in the past when we have had a shortage of nurses, but they've been kind of episodic. They've been short, and the market, as you know from Economics 101, would respond, and nurses would be paid more, and more people would be attracted to the industry, and the shortage would go away. That hasn't been the case with this shortage that has been going on since the late 90s, and experts predict that it's not going to go away in the near future. In fact, it's going to get worse as the supply of nurses is actually going to decline and demand is going to rise significantly. And that gap there is a really scary thing because, again, because of the central role that nurses play in the healthcare system, if there are not enough of them to take care of you and I, that's going to be a significant problem. So we've seen an increase in demand, and we've seen a decrease in the supply of nurses. One of the reasons for the increase in demand is a change in demographics. I think everybody's aware that the population in the United States is getting older. That is, we have a larger proportion of our population at middle age, in the later middle age, and in the elderly phase, and that's going to continue to skew in that direction for the foreseeable future. And this is actually a worldwide phenomenon that all societies are dealing with, and it's a function of a lot of things. including improvements in medical care over the last century or so that in that people are living longer. And as we get older, of course, we need more health care. Now you can see the two lines here with the X's represent, the top line represents more developed regions in the world and the proportion of the population over age 60 and how it's going to grow over time. The line beneath it with the stars signifies less developed regions of the world and their proportion aged 60 and over. The top two lines represent the proportion of the age below proportion of the population below 15 years of age, and you can see they're going in two different directions. We are going to have more and more people in that category of 60 years and older over time, and it's clearly the case that folks in that age group require more health care and consume a much greater proportion of health care than younger folks. And that's one of the reasons for the increase in demand for nurses. Now, when I say we have a shortage of nurses in this country, I think I need to clarify that probably. Because in actuality, we have all the nurses, that is, people who have graduated from nursing programs. We have all the nurses in this country we could use. Unfortunately, a significant number of those nurses are not working, are not available to work in the healthcare system. And in many cases, have simply chosen not to work in the healthcare system, to work in other professions. In 2000, it was 494,000. It's over, the statistics suggest, 500,000 now. And I think that needs a little explanation. Why are so many people who went through a nursing training program making the decision not to work in our healthcare system? Well, I've been looking at this a lot in the last several years, and I would say that the number one factor, this is a little bit hard to quantify, but the evidence suggests at least that there are many, many nurses in this country who have chosen not to work in the healthcare system because of the work environment. We have a healthcare system that, to some degree, is based on health insurance provided by HMOs and other groups. And HMOs put a lot of pressure on hospitals to keep healthcare costs down. And one of the ways hospitals have responded in the last 10, 15, 20 years to these pressures from insurance companies is to try to reduce the number of nurses who care for patients in hospitals and clinics. That is, to increase the ratio of nurses or decrease the ratio of nurses to patients. It used to be that if you were a nurse working on a standard medical surgical floor in a hospital, you might have to take care of 5 or 6 patients over the course of your work day. You were responsible for 5 or 6 patients. You kept an eye on them, you provided their medications, you examined them. But as hospitals cut the number of nurses, they increase the number of patients that nurses have to take care of. Up to 7, 8, 9. When we were first starting this work, we were at a nurses union, and they were selling T-shirts that said, "Don't be number 9." And they had to explain it. It was kind of an inside joke to nurses. What that means is you don't want to be the 9th person in a group of 9 patients that a nurse has to take care of, because you're not going to get the attention. You're not going to see that nurse the degree to which you should. So as this has happened, nurses find, particularly working in hospitals, to be a very stressful job. I'm married to a nurse. She teaches at Penn State, but she also, I'm not quite sure why, but takes every opportunity to work, taking care of patients. She wants to keep that connection. And even in her workplace, which isn't nearly as stressful as a hospital, she'll wake up in the middle of the night bolt upward, sit up, pick up the phone, call the clinic where she works, and ask if she gave a certain medication to a certain patient. She was so busy running around that she wasn't sure she had done it. And I'm told by nurses that this is just a way of life. They go home and they stress about whether they were able to give the proper kind of care to their patients. And this is a function of understaffing in a nursing environment. Understaffing is a big problem for nurses, but there are additional problems. There's a phenomenon called floating, where a nurse who usually works in a particular area, let's say maternity, because there are no babies in the maternity ward that day, is asked to go work someplace else, on a med-surg floor, for instance. Or in a worst case scenario, and I don't think this happens terribly often, but it has, in the emergency room. Well, those are very different skills. If you've been working in a maternity ward for 10 years and you're asked to go to the emergency room, you're going to be very nervous about giving care there. And it creates a tremendous amount of stress to go to a part of a hospital, for instance, where you're not sure you're up to speed, where you're not practiced in what's going on there. And floating occurs because of understaffing. There aren't enough nurses on the med-surg floor. We've got to pull a nurse from somewhere else. Another issue that causes great stress with nurses is mandatory overtime. Again, a function of understaffing. We don't have enough nurses in the hospital. One nurse calls off, so they approach a nurse that's worked her 8-hour shift and tell her that she has to stay for another 4 hours or another 8 hours. Well, again, you don't want to be on the other end of a nurse who's worked 15 or 16 hours. They're not alert. There have been studies that have shown that to the degree that accidents happen in hospitals, the accident rates go up more significantly when nurses have worked 14, 15, 16 hours. And so you have these kind of situations that nurses run into. They go into the profession with the best intentions, with a lot of commitment, with wanting to serve as nurses, but they burn out and they leave the profession. And right here in State College, I know a nurse that works out at Kaufman selling men's clothes. I know another nurse who has turned herself into a construction manager and has had a big role in building all these hotels you see around town. Nurses that work in boutiques. They go back to school to retrain as teachers. So again, the issue is not that we don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough nurses willing to work in our healthcare system. Secondly, basic economics would probably tell you that if you continued to raise the salaries of nurses, you would attract more people. And while salaries have been going up as a function of this shortage, they haven't gone up enough. The salaries of the average nurse today, and this is across the country, average years of service, not new nurses starting out, is about $49,000. That's 28% less, I looked up today, than elementary school teachers, who historically haven't been among our highest paid professionals. So for a kind of profession that's so critical to our healthcare system, there's a lot of people who argue that we should be paying nurses more, and if we paid nurses more, it would attract nurses into the workforce. We also don't have sufficient training programs and instructors. I think I have this right. I believe my wife told me that this year Penn State turned away 800 potential nursing students who were more or less qualified for admission to the program, because they simply don't have the instructors. Now, if the average nurse out in a hospital makes $49,000, I can tell you that nursing instructors make less. and in some instances significantly less. So every nurse they send out who goes to an urban hospital makes significantly more than the instructors who turn them out. But what that tells you is it's going to be very difficult to attract people into those instructors' positions. And all across the country, we have a severe shortage of nursing instructors. You don't have instructors, you can't produce more nurses. There's also evidence that women today have more career options. They can be teachers, they can go into the world of business, they can go into any profession. Whereas 30, 40 years ago, they were limited and many more went into nursing. And then there's also the issue of undesirable hours, which I'm very familiar with because my wife has over the years worked 3 to 11 and 11 to 7. Doesn't seem to mind it, but I think a lot of people do. And they think they can make more money doing something else and not have to work these hours. So there's a lot of reasons behind the nursing shortage in the United States. But this isn't just a phenomenon in the United States. We did a survey in 2001 of nurses' unions and associations around the world. And it was kind of neat because we got returns from nurses groups all over the globe: Fiji, Iceland, Slovenia, Mongolia. And it wasn't highly scientific, but it did give us a sense that the nursing shortage is global. It's worldwide. 69 of 76 nations that responded to the survey indicated in 2001 that they had a nursing shortage of some kind or another. We tend to get better statistics, much better statistics, from developed countries. And the projections right now are that the U.S. is going to have a shortage of over 250,000 nurses in 2010, and I think it's well over 500,000 nurses by 2020. The United Kingdom has a shortage of 50,000 nurses, Canada, Saudi Arabia. The Philippines now has a nursing shortage, which is an interesting case, and I'll mention that in a minute. And Sub-Saharan Africa has a shortage of 600,000 nurses. It's a worldwide phenomenon. And while we mentioned a little bit why we have this shortage in the United States, a developed country like the United States, the reasons are a little bit different, or perhaps just more severe in developing countries. If nurses in this country have a difficult work environment, nurses in developing countries have an even more problematic situation. We've traveled doing interviews in a number of countries in the world: South Africa, Namibia, a number of the countries in the Caribbean. And I think people just are not aware of the difficult situation that healthcare professionals in those countries have to operate under. Leaking roofs. I remember in the southern part of South Africa, a hospital where the roof was just riddled with holes, and there were buckets all over the place, right next to patients, right next to treatment rooms, water flowing in. Unsanitary conditions. My wife took a group of Penn State nursing students to South Africa last year, and when they got into the clinic, they asked for gloves. And they might as well have been asking for the moon, because you don't have gloves in a rural clinic in South Africa. If you have one, you use them over and over again, which tends to defeat the purpose. I'll talk in a minute about the nurse-to-patient ratios, but they really are a significant problem in many poor countries around the world. And of course, there's the epidemic of HIV, AIDS. We were at a hospital in Johannesburg, South Africa, where every month they would have a memorial service for the nurses who have died of AIDS. Now, it's not clear to me whether that has to do with the practice of nursing, but certainly with so many nurses having the disease and dying of AIDS, it makes it even more difficult to build up a substantial nurse workforce. The salary and benefits are pitiful. They too have an even more significant problem of insufficient training programs and instructors, and they have some of the same problems that folks in developing countries or developed countries face. Well, we have a nursing shortage all around the world. How have developed countries chosen to deal with this nursing shortage? Well, the main strategy seems to be to recruit and hire foreign nurses. Now, in the issue of migration, in any occupation that you look at in terms of migration, you need to look at push and pull factors. Push factors are the factors that cause people to leave their country, to go somewhere else to work, somewhere else better. And you also have pull factors. You have factors that attract people from their their native country to a new country. And I want to just put these up very quickly. They somewhat duplicate the problems behind the nursing shortage. You'll see some of the same issues. But if you were a nurse in a poor developing country having to practice under very, very difficult conditions, not being able to provide a very good quality of life for your family on the basis of that practicing that profession, sometimes in a situation where you have political instability, war, ethnic strife, you can imagine the attraction of moving to another country where you wouldn't have those kind of issues to deal with. Again, just to give you some sense of the environment that many nurses work in, this is a hospital called Bara. I'll call it that because I always mangle the name. It's said to be the largest hospital in the Southern Hemisphere. It's in Soweto, which is just outside of South Africa. And it's a couple miles, the complex is a couple miles long by a couple miles wide. Tens of thousands of patients, thousands and thousands of nurses and physicians. And we were able to tour this site, and it's very different than a hospital here in the United States. Patients have to bring their own linen, for instance. In many cases, they have to feed the members of their family that are there. You don't have the kind of equipment that you have here. You don't have the kind of facilities, the sanitation, etc. Very difficult conditions. And added to that, hospitals in many developing countries are very dangerous. This is a sign, I think it was at Bara, it was certainly at one of the Johannesburg hospitals, warning patients about walking a certain route to the parking lot. And it kind of gets your attention when there's a gun pointed right at you. That not only do nurses experience crime on the way to and from work, in our survey of nurses around the world, we found that bullying, a term that's used around the rest of the world more than it's used here, workplace violence, is a very, very serious problem for nurses. This hospital in Johannesburg, I happened to find a website where surgical residents would kind of chat back and forth about where they might do their residency. And all the talk on this one website was about how working at Bara, it was the greatest place to do a surgical residency, because every night hundreds of people were brought in with stabbings and gunshot wounds, and you get more surgery time than you would any place else in the world. And sometimes that kind of violence follows the patients into the hospital. A gang didn't finish off the person that they shot. Well, they follow them to the hospital and come in and finish the job there. Nurses and other healthcare professionals working in a very, very difficult environment. You can imagine the attraction of working in a developed country like the U.S., the U.K., Canada, Australia, better compensation, better working conditions. You can do your job without facing violence. And even though we have our own problems here, the situation would be seen as much better than it is in their home situation. And here's an example of the difference in the difference in compensation. This is a headline from the Latin Trade Journal. As we'll talk about in a minute, we've been recruiting nurses from all over the world, and only in the last year or two have we really turned to Mexico, because there's a language problem in many cases with nurses there. But that's the next frontier for us recruiting nurses. And in this instance, apparently, going to work in California at a hospital would be a 900% raise. So the pull factors are very, very strong for nurses to come here and practice. I wanted to give you a little sense of the flow of nurses in this worldwide labor market. The UK probably recruits more nurses than any other healthcare system. They get the largest number from the Philippines. And after that, they tend to draw nurses from former colonies, British colonies like South Africa, Australia, India, Ghana, and the Caribbean. In the U.S., the largest number of nurses come from the Philippines. Now, I should mention that the Philippines traditionally has been different than any other country in the sense that it actually produces more nurses than it needs for the purpose of basically exporting them. And Philippine nurses are known around the world as being well trained, and they go abroad and they send back what's called remittances. That is, they make money abroad and they send a portion of it back to their family to support their family in the Philippines. And remittances from Filipino workers of all kinds are a staple of the Filipino economy. Now, it's just been in the last couple of years that all of a sudden the Philippines doesn't have a surplus of nurses. Yet we're still recruiting large numbers of nurses from that country. Some of the migration is from developed to developed countries, that is, from Canada to the U.S., or Canada to the U.K., or Australia to Ireland. We get nurses from Canada, India, Nigeria, the Caribbean countries, and as I mentioned, just recently starting to recruit nurses in substantial numbers from Mexico and Central America. Here's some other examples. I wanted to mention too here, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia needs, I believe it's about 100,000 nurses to care for its population. They only have 54,000 of those jobs filled, so they have a significant nursing shortage. 53,000 of those nurses are from abroad, and the other just 1,000 are Saudi nurses. And you do have migration between developing countries. South Africa is still a developing country, but it is economically doing significantly better than most countries in Africa. So you have this phenomenon where the UK and Australia and Ireland will poach nurses from South Africa, I'll use that verb, and then South Africa will recruit nurses from surrounding countries in the southern part of Africa, Tanzania, Botswana, Namibia, to deal with their shortage. The problem that really is significant are those countries that don't have anywhere to go to make up for their shortage of nurses. Tanzania, Botswana, Zimbabwe cannot recruit nurses from anywhere else. They're at the bottom of the food chain, so to speak. We'll get back to that in a minute. Now, some of the interesting ethical questions that are raised by this are, how do you balance the interests and the needs of the various stakeholders here? You have emigrating nurses, nurses who leave their country to go elsewhere. It's a basic human right to be able to emigrate to make your life better. So you simply can't deal with this problem by telling nurses that they're locked into their country and they can't go out into the global marketplace. You have the healthcare systems of developing nations who lose nurses year in and year out, and that creates or makes poor healthcare systems even worse. And then you have the interests of developed nations that have opportunities to provide other nurses that have a need and fill that need by recruiting from abroad. So I wanted to talk just a minute about the costs and the benefits of nurse recruitment and migration. You know, if you're a nurse in a developing country, there are a lot of benefits to emigrating. Better salaries, much improved working conditions, professional development opportunities that you could only dream of in other countries, and a better life for yourself and your family. And the costs, there are costs. They tend to be idiosyncratic, that is, they affect people in different ways. Some people who are tied very closely to their families, will pay a significant cost for going halfway around the world to work. And there's always some cultural adjustment involved when a nurse goes abroad. Not only do they have to be trained to work in a different healthcare system, but there are all kinds of cultural issues. You can imagine if you were a nurse going to Saudi Arabia, the kind of cultural transition you would have to make and the things that you would have to adjust to. So on balance, really, there are greater benefits for nurses who choose to emigrate. It's a great opportunity. For developed countries, to some degree, it also is a win-win situation. But there's a lot of evidence that it's only a short-term fix, this recruitment of nurses from abroad. 13% of the nurses in the United Kingdom in 2002 were from abroad. We have approximately 100,000 foreign nurses working in the U.S., or we did as of 2003. So recruiting foreign nurses is helpful. It fills jobs that otherwise wouldn't be filled. Although there has not been a lot of research looking at the effectiveness of foreign nurses, how quickly they adapt to our system of health care. We have a much more sophisticated kind of healthcare system with a lot of technology that you would not get in many countries. So if you're trained as a nurse in Botswana, there's a tremendous investment that has to be made in a nurse to come here or the UK before they can really function. There are costs for developed countries, for wealthier countries. There are recruitment costs, training costs, as I say, that hospitals have to put in to a new nurse brought from abroad. If that nurse decides to return to her home country, there's a loss of the investment that you've put into training. And there's another cost that I think is often overlooked. We see the kind of an odd situation where developed countries provide significant amount of health care aid to developing countries, both public and private aid going to, let's say, Africa for AIDS or HIV, sending medicines there that will help with the problem, technologies. But if you don't have the healthcare professionals to care for the patients, to use the technology, to administer the medications, then a lot of that effort, a lot of that aid can be wasted. So it's not an entirely win-win situation for developed countries when they recruit nurses. But of course, the real losers in this transaction are developing countries. Now, there are benefits. I mentioned remittances that nurses who go abroad send back to their families, and that money goes into the economy of the Philippines and other countries. And there always is the possibility that a nurse who goes abroad and receives additional training, gains additional experience in a more advanced healthcare system, might come home and bring that experience, bring that investment back to the healthcare system. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of incentives to stay and not to return home. But the costs are very significant. In most developing countries, nursing programs are completely funded by the public sector, by the government. You can go here in the United States to a university, even a university like the University of Pennsylvania has a nursing program, and you can pay a lot of money to go through a nursing program. It's usually funded by the individual or through financial aid. But in developing countries, usually there isn't tuition involved. It's all provided by the government, and the government also provides a living stipend to nursing students. So there's a tremendous investment that goes into training nurses. And when those nurses go abroad, that country loses these valuable resources that they have invested in a young healthcare professional. Sometimes you have nurses that have been working in the system a while that leave. You lose their experience. And ultimately, the source country's ability to provide care for its citizens is diminished. So you have the situation where you have already dysfunctional healthcare systems that are made more dysfunctional when nurses are recruited from abroad. You have this loss of human capital. Then you need to train another nurse to take the place of the one that left, and there's no guarantee that that nurse will stay around, so there's significant investment costs. Now, I talked about the shortage around the world, and I think these numbers, probably more than anything else, drive home the state of healthcare in many poor countries. If you scan down the list quickly to the United States, Cuba, and Canada, you'll see that we have one nurse for every 100,000 people in this country. Or we have, I should say, 772 nurses for every 100,000 people in this country. And in Canada, for some reason, they have over 1,000 nurses for each 100,000. But then if you go up the list here, you'll see that South Africa has about half the number of nurses per 100,000 that we have. Mexico has less than half, certainly. India, 61. Up the list to Ghana and Liberia that have less than 10 nurses per 100,000 population. I don't know that we'll have a chance to talk about physicians, but the numbers are even more startling for physicians. And to add to the difficulty of being a nurse in this kind of situation, where you have so many patients to take care of and so few nurses, there are even fewer doctors. So nurses in many of these countries are de facto physicians. They do many, many of the things that physicians would do in more advanced countries. They may not be trained to do that, but you are the best resource available in many parts of Liberia, Ghana, Africa, and even some parts of the Caribbean. So nurses are a valuable commodity in these countries. They have tremendous demands placed on them. Whenever you go to a clinic or a hospital of any kind, you have lines that snake out the hospital into the street, down the road, of people waiting for care. They queue up, and they may wait all day for care. They end up coming back the next day because they couldn't get in the previous day. Many of these countries are working very hard to develop a better healthcare system, but it's kind of like spinning your wheels in the snow or the mud. You work harder and harder to train healthcare professionals, and they're going out the other end of the system. And I know I've mentioned Africa a lot, but it's not just Africa. In the Caribbean, for instance, this is the Port-au-Prince Hospital in Trinidad. We went in and talked to the director of nursing there, who was, I guess not surprisingly, pretty hostile to a couple of Americans who wanted to talk about the nursing shortage, the nursing crisis. This is a very large hospital, the largest hospital in Port-au-Prince, largest hospital in Trinidad. And she said they have 50% of their nursing jobs filled. And you can imagine the stress that puts on the nurses that are there. They're frazzled, they're burnt out. And we talked about how nurses might come back to the system and be a plus to the healthcare system of a developing country. When we were talking to this head of nursing at this hospital, and we were a little bit surprised to find that there's tremendous resentment to nurses who go abroad. You shouldn't be surprised if you think of this phenomenon as making a stressful situation even worse. And what they do when nurses come back is they essentially punish them by putting them at the back of the queue, giving them the worst assignments, treating them as if they're just starting out as beginning nurses, which of course provides a disincentive for nurses to come back and use the expertise that they've gained. Well, I'll wrap up here in a few minutes so we can have some time to talk. But it's an interesting question, how to balance the benefits to individuals and importing nations with the cost to exporting countries. And there's a number of different strategies that have been proposed. Some are even being tried out to deal with the problems created by migration. One is to restrict or regulate immigration or recruitment. It'd be very simple if you could just tell nurses that they couldn't immigrate. But again, that's a basic human right. You can't punish those nurses who want to go out into the marketplace and make their lives better. But there are ways, perhaps, to restrict or regulate immigration recruiting. And so who would do that? Well, that's a little joke, because the World Health Organization is one of the main groups that does focus on these kind of issues. It is trying to bring some order to this kind of phenomenon. The International Labor Organization, which is a UN body that deals with workers' issues, is also looking at the issue. Perhaps the best model we have so far is the Commonwealth nations. Those are nations formerly a part of the British Empire, basically, have banded together and signed a code of practice for the international recruitment of healthcare workers. Because in addition to the other problems, one of the problems we saw in the early part of this decade was unscrupulous recruiters who would go abroad and recruit nurses from developing countries, basically put them in a significant amount of debt, bring them to developed countries, basically garnish their paychecks, take their passports. So it was a form of almost indentured servitude. So at least codes like this are creating codes of ethics and practice for recruiters, which does address one problem. Some countries are also trying to step in and take a more proactive role in recruiting, in the recruiting problem. The UK's National Health Service, a couple years ago, made the policy decision that they were no longer going to recruit nurses from abroad, which was a big step forward. But it didn't completely eliminate the problem, because in most countries where there's a public health care system, there's also a private health care system. And the private health care system in the UK wasn't restricted from recruiting and bringing nurses in. And once you were in the country, then you could move on to the National Health Service, which has the most jobs in the healthcare system there. The UK has also made an agreement with South Africa where they would do an exchange, where they would offer nurses and physicians the opportunity to come to the UK for 6 months and work there. And nurses and physicians from the UK would be given some incentives to go to South Africa for 6 months. So there would be an exchange that would not, result in a lessening or a reduction in the healthcare workforce in the UK. Another issue, there have been some discussion of trying to make developed countries repay developing countries for the investment that's lost when they recruit nurses from abroad. Well, if you take the U.S., basically the people who are bringing nurses from abroad are hospitals in the private sector. I don't think that most developing countries have the wherewithal to force American hospitals to pay a tax, if you were. And I don't think we're going to see the American government anytime in the future forcing American healthcare companies and American hospitals to pay a tax to other countries. So I'm not sure that has a lot of legs. One encouraging development we've seen in the Caribbean, where Caribbean countries have realized that they have limited options in dealing with this, but they've been pretty proactive in doing what they can. They've created a program called Managed Migration. Managed Migration, where did you go? Okay, well, Managed Migration is an effort to try to reduce the migration of nurses from the Caribbean countries by increasing the status of nursing in their countries. They have strategies and events and ways of doing this. Managed Migration tries to create a situation where nurses will go abroad, but there's a systematic way of encouraging them and enticing them to come back. And this program has had some impact. In a country like the United States, I think probably the most effective, straightforward way of addressing this issue is to address the supply problem. That benefits us as well as the countries that we're poaching nurses from. And by this I basically mean trying to address the problems that create the nurse shortage in the first place. That is, trying to address the problems that nurses experience on the job: understaffing, mandatory overtime, floating, and in some cases inadequate salaries and benefits. The latest research we're involved in is research that's looking at ways to give nurses in the United States a greater voice in patient care. If you understand much about our system of health insurance, far too many of the decisions about patient care are made by HMOs and insurance companies. And I hope my brother will forgive me, but by administrators and bean counters and accountants. I would be much more comfortable personally with giving nurses a greater voice in how patients are going to be cared for. And actually, the institution that we're looking at that addresses all of these issues, or has addressed these issues most effectively in the United States in recent years, are nurses' unions. Nurses' unions are one of the few areas of the American labor movement that is, the occupation of nurses is growing in terms of union density. The bottom line is the percentage of the workforce in unions. The top line is percentage of registered nurses in unions. And while most other occupations are becoming less unionized, nurses, at least in the short term, we see a greater number of nurses turning to unions. Now that's an issue for another lecture, because it's nurses really are trained to be selfless caregivers, and they have a real difficult time forming a union because they think it's basically selfish. But what American unions are doing is making the case to nurses that we're just not about better salaries and benefits. In fact, our research shows that that's not the prime issue that's going to get nurses to vote for the union. It's, can you prove to the nurses that you can make patient, that you can give the nurses a bigger role, a greater role in patient care? Nurses respond to that very positively, and it makes sense. They use their collective strength to benefit the patients. That they're comfortable with. And so I think that has a lot of potential as well. Well, I've probably gone a few minutes longer than I planned to. To summarize, there's a big problem around the world with the migration of healthcare professionals. There are no easy answers. There is a very significant ethical dimension to this, the damage that we are doing to developing countries. But as I say, there's no ready-made solution. And right now, here's probably a good note to end on. The only response, policy response, that we've had in terms of our federal government to this issue is a proposal that's kind of tucked into the immigration bill that's been batted around in Congress. And that provision to the immigration bill would make it much, much easier for us to recruit Mexican nurses. Now, it may strike you as a little surprising because much of the debate about immigration is about keeping people out of the country. But where we see it in our self-interest, clearly in our self-interest to make it easier for folks from Mexico to come, we do that readily. And of course, the expectation is this would have a very negative impact on the Mexican healthcare system, which is nowhere near nearly as good as our system. So that's kind of the lay of the land on the issue. I'd be happy to talk a little bit about physicians or to answer questions if folks would like to ask them. Yeah, Paul.
Thanks. You just briefly mentioned the role of corporations in healthcare. I wonder if you could speak a little more to the issue of, but because typically you're talking about a country does this, a country does that, but that's not the relevant unit here. Mm-hmm. It's a corporation of some kind. So I wonder if you could address the role, both practical and ethical, of healthcare for profit, as in this country. And then sort of the flip side of that was I noticed in your table of the number of nurses per 100,000, Cuba is the second highest. What are they doing different from anybody else, and what could we learn from them? Thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, in those questions. But you're right. Our healthcare system is a private healthcare system with either nonprofit or for-profit providers. I can tell you one of the things we're doing here, and I don't know how much comfort it is to countries around the world, but we are exporting our healthcare system. That is, the big HMOs around this country, despite the fact that a lot of people would argue our system doesn't work very well, are going around the world promoting this approach to healthcare. And in some countries like Australia and even in the UK, they're starting to make some inroads. And as if the rest of the world hasn't suffered enough, now we're going to inflict our healthcare system on them. But in terms of the specific issue of recruitment, recruitment to the United States is done by private employers who either send recruiters abroad or hire recruiting agencies. There's a whole cottage industry out there of recruiters who go abroad and recruit nurses. We don't have in place the kind of codes of conduct, ethical codes that the UK and others have. And so it's there's a sense that there are some problems with the methods that are used to recruit people to the United States. Now, I don't know that that's the pervasive practice, that these recruiters are unethical for the most part, but we do have anecdotal information that many times there are problems. People have limited information. They want to come here. They have to depend on a for-profit recruiter who's paid by the head to bring people in here, and they use whatever means, in some instances, they need to get people here. I don't think that entirely responds to your question, Paul, but there are a couple dimensions. I think that responds to a couple dimensions at least.
You want to mention Cuba?
Oh, Cuba. The quick answer is that Cuba devotes a much significantly greater proportion of their resources to health care. They actually do create or train or produce more physicians and nurses than they need, and they don't send them around the world to generate revenue for the economy. They send them around the world as a sort of foreign aid. And I think the simple answer is they have just chosen to make that a priority. Certainly, our country could afford to raise the salaries and benefits of nurses to the degree that it would attract plenty of people into the profession. We've just chosen not to. We've chosen to use those resources in other ways.
I'm always interested when people use cost-benefit analyses, because part of what I find is that the lists are always incomplete, and sometimes things that should be costs are in the benefit column and vice versa. But I had noticed a couple of things I saw that weren't on your list that I thought might be interesting to add. One is, it was interesting that in your list of people who, when you're categorizing costs and benefits, you have patients out. Mm-hmm. And I would hope that the nurse and the family would point that out to you as something kind of important in the system. The other thing is that I was curious about the costs of problems with communication. So if you have a nurse who has come in from another system where things are very different, there's got to be some problems with lack of communication in terms of procedures, communications between the doctors and the nurses, and communications between nurses and patients. And in addition to that, you may have language barriers with some of these, or just different language usages, even when the English is the language of the other country. So I was curious if you had any comments.
Well, you're absolutely right. If we're going to list stakeholders, patients should be on the list. There hasn't been much research, though, that looks at the impact of this phenomenon on patients, funny enough. And I'm a little hesitant to speculate about the quality of care provided by foreign nurses. But I think it's logical to assume that when you add in potential health language issues, now you'll see that most of the recruitment is from countries where English is the first language. Even in Africa and countries in the Caribbean, we recruit English speakers. Mexico, it's not going to be the case. And one of the things we're doing now is actually going to Mexican nursing schools and giving them lots of money to create nurses who speak English, who can come across the border. I mean, for better or worse, we're going to train our own. That's another potential solution. But if you're trained in a developing country as a nurse, you are trained to function in a very different kind of environment. And I think one of the things that's we don't have evidence on. But in some ways, we end up starting from scratch, and we bring a nurse over, but there's so much training that's involved to use the kind of technology we have here. Maybe they speak English, but there are problems in terms of vocabulary or terminology. And, we have a significant problem with errors in hospitals in this country that often come, at least in part, one of the problems we have is physicians who don't write clearly on prescriptions. And you can imagine trying to decipher that if English is your second language, when nurses who have spoken English all their lives can't do it. So it would be logical to assume, I think, that this is not the most efficient way to provide a nursing workforce, and probably to provide the highest quality nurse workforce the most efficiently, by retraining nurses who are trained in an entirely different healthcare system. But like I say, there's been very little research on the impacts of this phenomenon on the patients themselves. And of course, folks in my field aren't equipped to do that. Folks in the healthcare fields are. Yeah.
First, a sort of quick anecdote to corroborate some of what you've been saying, and secondly, a question. Some years ago, at, of all places, a bachelor party, I got into a conversation with somebody who was a nurse and was now a mortician. And he explained to me that the reason he left nursing and became a mortician was that he wanted more time to care for those in his charge and comfort their families. So that certainly reinforces your idea that working conditions are disincentive. But the question that I have for you is, obviously, there's a similar inadequacy in the number of physicians globally. But my question for you is this: is migration of physicians as much of a problem, or does recertification and requalification in other countries create more obstacles to the migration of physicians?
Well, I should add, and I didn't mention that that's an interesting story about the mortician. And it does reinforce, I think, my comment about organizing nurses, that caring for patients is really why they get into the profession. And the irony of someone going into the funeral business because they can be of greater aid and comfort to a family is really interesting. And I should also add that when nurses do come to this country, they must pass a certification examination before they can practice here. That is one of the quality control checks. It's not the case in all countries around the world, but we have a fairly rigorous examination that foreign nurses need to take before they can practice. I don't know what the situation is for physicians in terms of that, but I understand they probably have to take boards. They have to be certified in the same way that our physicians is a quality control check. But the migration of physicians has been going on for a very long time, and the dynamics of it are that they are very similar in the sense that you have countries around the world where there are very, very, very few physicians. And to recruit away 1 or 2 or 3 physicians from a country like Tanzania or Liberia has a tremendous effect on these countries. I'm not sure that the issue is any less of a problem particularly. There's significant migration. There's a significant labor market for physicians. In fact, in many countries in the world, 34% of physicians in New Zealand are from abroad. 26% of our physicians in this country are from abroad. Now, I don't really have any idea the impact that has on our healthcare system, other than we do have a shortage of physicians in this country, and it helps in that regard. But I think the dynamics are still the same in terms of the impact it has on the countries from which they come. It just makes a bad situation worse. I do think, from some reading I've done, that the market for physicians is a little more sophisticated. There's better information. There's better access. There's almost kind of routes that have been used for years and years, networks that bring physicians to developed countries. But there is, again, an ethical dimension there. Yeah.
With the concept of the migration of physicians and also of nurses, you mentioned earlier that nursing still tends to be fairly gendered, and that there's a much higher percentage of women nurses than men. Is the physician category gendered in the opposite swing with a higher percentage of men than women? And and if not, either way, what I was curious about is what package sort of comes with physicians when it comes to migration in terms of visa and family relocation? Like, are physicians given the ability to bring their entire family, spouse, children with them to the country that they migrate to? And are nurses given that same option? And if nurses aren't, does this run a parallel in sort of an ethical question of like female or woman trafficking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting question. To start, the profession of the occupation, physician's occupation, is not nearly as gendered as nursing. In the U.S., it's about 95% male. It's a little less so in developing countries, I believe. I don't have the statistics to back this up, but just from interviewing people and being in hospitals there, you see more males. I don't know what the breakdown is for physicians. There obviously are many, many more, a higher proportion of female physicians, but I don't know how what it is relative to male. I don't have a lot of information about the process of bringing physicians into this country, but I do know a little more about nurses, and I think that it's probably somewhat similar. You're correct that there is often a package that is offered to a nurse that involves travel, involves perhaps some education or preparation to take the nursing exam, relocation costs in some instances. I would assume that those are all much more significant for physicians than they probably are for nurses. The issue of bringing family abroad, I don't know if there's any special provisions. I'm not aware of any special provisions for nurses. But I do know that the immigration laws make some provision for people who are given working visas here to stay for a period of time, to get established, and over time they do have some privileges to bring family in. But I couldn't really speak to the issue of whether that issue is handled differently for what would be an occupation that has a much higher proportion of males than it is for females. But certainly one of the big motivations for nurses to come here is to be able to bring their families. That's a fairly common practice.
I'm going to do the last question because we have to stop in 5 minutes. One comment and one question. You talked about how the ability to move and to migrate is a basic human right. And we often forget that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, basic human rights include the right to health care, food, etc. And so it's important to not privilege mobility over certain other human rights, and it's possible in an ethically informed human rights agenda to think about migration and immigration in that broader context, in my opinion. My question is, I know that in the labor movement, cross-border organizing is the only hope for the labor movement in the future. And I just wondered, in the work you've done with nurses organizations globally, whether beyond the very hard work these organizations have taken up to improve working conditions, there are transnational efforts to tackle this issue as well.
Yeah, the answer is no, basically.
Exactly.
There's been very little of that going on. The American Federation of Teachers Healthcare Division sent a delegation over to South Africa and Botswana a couple years ago, but it was largely to provide kind of technical help. There's been very little, if any, effort now to develop relationships with nurses' unions in other countries and to tackle this issue. American nurses' unions have taken positions that there should be codes of conduct for recruiters, and that we should consider the ethical implications. They've passed policy statements. They are trying to raise awareness about the provision in the immigration bill about Mexican nurses. But one of the areas where there's been very little research done is on the impact of this phenomenon on the nurses who emigrate. I suggested that it's kind of a win for them. But there's some reason to believe that the experience of migrating brings with it a certain amount of costs. And the next piece of research we're going to be engaged in is going to be looking at the phenomenon of Mexican nurses coming to the U.S. in the southwest part of this country and trying to interview nurses and finding out what the experience has been. Do they face racism? Do they have are the language problems significant? Are the cultural problems significant? Are they exploited and abused in some way that isn't visible? And one of the things we hope to do is talk to the union that represents Mexican nurses, and to see if we can begin a dialogue with them and perhaps begin a dialogue between some of the American nurses' unions. But there has been unfortunately, given the first part of your statement, while this is a very, very significant issue, across the board there's been woefully little effort in this area between the American labor movement and other parts of the world. It's starting to happen. But in terms of nurses' unions, it's significantly farther behind that.
Well, let's all thank Paul, and thank you for coming. Just want to remind you to check on the poster and join us at the next 7 of these presentations.